You're listening to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, where we do fast, fun, free daily deep dives into books of the Bible. And right now, we're going through Esther.
Hey everybody, I'm Matt, and if you were with me for the last series or the last season, whatever you want to call it, of this podcast, then if you're listening in real time, you're probably still pretty fresh on the big picture of the Old Testament and the New Testament, because we went through the whole thing, one book per day. And I don't know about you, but I found that to be very helpful. The story all hangs together better in my brain than it did before we went through that exercise. And I think it'll probably make it a little easier for us to remember where Esther fits in the grand story of the Old Testament as we talk about that for the next few minutes right now. So very big picture for everybody, whether you've been around this or not before. The Bible is divided into two big sections. You got the New Testament, that covers the stuff about the life of Jesus and the early church, and then you got the Old Testament. There's about a 400-year gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the last history books of the Old Testament are Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, which are all set in Persia. So when you and I are processing through the book of Esther, we are right at the very end of the whole narrative part of the Old Testament. The first chunk of the Old Testament is where you get all the history books. It's where you get all the narrative stuff. There's a little bit of bonus narrative that comes later on in the Old Testament in the book of Daniel and a few other of those prophets. But for the most part, what you get in the first 17 books is a roughly chronological story that follows God's redemptive plan. And usually we are led along by the descendants of Abraham. That's kind of our point of view family that gets us through the whole story. The book of Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament, starts in time immemorial, before there's any creation or physical stuff to even orient time to. And in that setting, God decides, you know what would be cool is if there was stuff. And so God sets out to make things, and he does make things, and he calls it good. But then sin and failure is initiated into that perfect creation. Death is part and parcel of what comes along with that. And you find yourself wondering as you read it, like, well, what's God going to do? Is he just going to wash the whole thing away and start over so that there won't be any corruption in his beautiful system that he made? Or does he have some motivation to fix it? And fortunately for you, me, and everyone, he chooses to fix it. The first several chapters then of the Old Testament are this primeval age when great big characters and great big events are occurring that all paint a picture of how humanity is not going to be able to solve the problem of sin and death and failure that has been introduced into the system on their own, and how we're going to need some kind of new paradigm to fix what's wrong. Hinted throughout the book of Genesis is that somebody is coming, some kind of deliverance is coming, and there's going to be a character who brings about that new paradigm to straighten out the mess and redeem what has been broken. Well, then we move out of this distant past primeval era as we meet a guy named Abraham. Interestingly, this Abraham guy, who was originally called Abram, he's kind of from Persia, not exactly where Persia is on a map, but getting in that direction. But then immediately God calls him to go way west, and we don't get back out toward Persia for many, many years after that. As we were talking about yesterday, when we were talking about the Feast of Purim and what happened in Egypt and the Feast of Passover, Abraham's descendants find themselves in slavery in Egypt. It's a bad deal. I mean, slavery generally is. And eventually God decides that slavery needs to end, but Pharaoh isn't going to just let a whole bunch of slaves go. And so God raises up a leader named Moses, and God uses Moses' leadership as well as a bunch of supernatural plagues that range from kind of silly and funny to absolutely horrifying to break the will of Pharaoh, who finally lets the people go. And after some wandering out in the wilderness, they eventually take a land that God has promised to them. That is the land of Canaan, which roughly corresponds to modern-day Israel. Well, initially, they don't have kings or anything. They just try to have a theocracy, but it doesn't go well. And for several hundred years through the book of Judges, we are reminded of the absolute depravity and hopelessness of this situation. People cannot fix their problem. And so then as we get into the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, we see the people saying, all right, we're going to need a king like everybody else has in order to make this thing work. And Samuel's like, I don't know about that. And kings, they're pretty tricky. But the people are like, no, give us one of those. So God, through Samuel, gives them a king. And the first one is Saul. And sure enough, he's very problematic. And the second king is David. David is much better, but also is flawed in all kinds of ways. David's most notable contribution is a new promise that God makes to him. David communicates to God that he wants to build God a great temple so that God can dwell in that temple among his people. The presence of God can be in there. And God's like, yeah, we're going to do the temple at some point. I'm actually going to have one of your descendants do that. But instead, I'm going to build something for you. And it's a great lineage of kings that will one day result in a singular great king who will show up and will reign forever. And the indication is like, this is the one we've been waiting for, the one who's going to redeem everything and fix everything. So that's pretty exciting. There's a bunch of other awesome things about David's reign. There's also some icky things about David's reign. And out of that comes his son Solomon, who, is a pretty good king for the most part as well. But like all the kings that we read about in the Bible, he makes some mistakes, and the result is a civil war between his offspring that results in a permanent separation of Abraham's descendants into two separate kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom gets most of the 12 tribes of Israel. The southern kingdom just gets a couple of those tribes, but the southern kingdom has the city of David, the city of Jerusalem, where that temple is. Well, then through the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, and then rehashed in the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we read about the utter failure of the kings of the north and the partial failure of the kings in the south. The failure of the kings in the north by trying to play political games with all of the mega powers of the ancient world like Egypt and Assyria. It eventually bites them in the butt, and the Assyrians come along in 722 BC and they eliminate the northern kingdom. It's gone. 10 of the 12 tribes of the descendants of Abraham are gone. This is a problem because there's a redemptive plan in place, and if you lose those 10, that means you only got 1/6 of the remaining tribes left, and they are the carriers of this promise from God to redeem. This is getting a little precarious. Well, fast forward another 150 years, the Assyrians get beaten. We're going to talk about that in depth as we get deeper into the Persia history stuff. But the Babylonians are now significant, and along comes their great king Nebuchadnezzar, and in 586, he conquers the southern kingdom as well. And now it's gone too, and the temple gets destroyed, and Nebuchadnezzar takes away almost all of the descendants of Abraham who remain into captivity in Babylon. And it looks like this could be the end of everything. But it turns out not to be, because there's this remnant of descendants of Abraham who are faithful to God and are trying to listen to what God says and are preserving and reflecting on the word of God, and they flourish in Babylon. And it turns out Babylon wasn't around for very long. And within a generation, Babylon gets defeated by, get ready for it, Persia. In 539 BC, Babylon falls to Persia, and the Persians start reversing the things that the Babylonians and even the Assyrians had done. The first king of the Persian Empire is a guy named Cyrus the Great, and he says to the Jews, you can go back and you can rebuild things. And so the story of Ezra and Nehemiah is the story of the somewhat clumsy, often interrupted, but eventually successful rebuilding project undertaken over the course of the reigns of several Persian kings to put Jerusalem back together, to build a new temple, and to restore the sacrificial system, the religious rhythms that had been interrupted by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. And then the final book of the historical section of the Old Testament is about Persia. We pinch zoom in on one situation with one particular lady and her big ally, and their wicked enemy, not just of these two characters, but of all the Jewish people. And so the final episode of the Old Testament places us somewhere in the early 400s BC in the royal court of Persia, and it puts back into play, back into jeopardy, the whole redemptive plan, because if the bad guys in the book of Esther kill all the Jewish people by a manipulated royal edict, then I guess the redemptive plan is just off. How is God going to deliver his people is the question that the attentive reader to the whole Old Testament is asking as we get to the book of Esther, the final historical book of the Jewish scriptures of the Old Testament. I know some of you have heard that story a few times because it came up in the last series we did, but it's important and it's worth it, and it sets us all up for success and gets us all on the same page as we come into the book of Esther together, whether you've been hanging around with me on this podcast in the past or whether you're just getting here now. Now, big picture here, a few days ago, we took a peek at the first few verses of Esther, and we could all tell that this is a book that is going to be best understood in its biblical and historical context. And we've done the Bible context part. It means that next time around, we're going to go and do the historical context part, which is juicy and salacious and scandalous and interesting from beginning to end. Can't wait. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast exists because many of you kick in to make it happen, even though you don't have to. Learn more at thetmbh.com/support.